We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America.
In the summer of 1787, 55 men would gather in Philadelphia. They were tasked with fixing the government of the United States of America. Over the course of 4 months, they would debate, argue, refine and prepare the first document of its kind in the history of mankind, an attempt to prove that men can rule themselves by law. Over the next 3 years, the 13 United States would debate the ratification. This is the story of those men and of those times. It is a look at the ideas, the concepts, the debates, and the history of the Constitution of the United States. This is Constitution Thursday.
These being the words of Marcus Tullius Cicero. When I was a young man, I defended our state. As an old man, I shall not abandon it. I give sincere thanks to Mark Antony, who has generously presented me with the most promising theme imaginable. I address you directly, Antony. Please listen as if you go on. Please listen as if you were sober and intelligent and not a drink-sodden, sex-addled wreck.
These are the words of Cicero, a highly dramatized account of the beginning of Cicero's Phillipics against Mark Antony. People ask me all the time, Dave, why study history? Who cares? I mean, it was a long time ago. It doesn't really matter anymore. Nobody really understands these things. But it's important, and this is a good example of why. All right, if we don't learn from history, we're doomed to repeat its mistakes. Well, it's obvious that we don't learn from it because we keep repeating the same mistakes over and over again. And yet somehow or another, we hope, think, assume this time it'll be different. That's Dave's second law. People don't change. They do the same things for the same reasons with the same results throughout history. Now, the flip side to that is that they convince themselves this time it'll be different because of technology or intelligence, whatever. We see this in communism. Every time there's a failed communist state, we get the next group of communists that come along who believe that they can do it better because they're smarter or they have better technology or whatever. It still doesn't work. Why? Because the foundational concept is flawed. Well, when you don't learn those lessons, you keep making those same mistakes over and over again. When we look at Rome, particularly Rome before Octavian, or as you know him, Augustus, Rome was a republic. Now, it was not a republic like we think of a republic in the strictest of senses, but it was a republic, and it had a constitution, and it was a very detailed system of government. They were very precise about things. There's some reasons why things happened the way they did and why they have stayed with us throughout history. We use the phrase, oh, so-and-so crossed the Rubicon. Well, that's a reference to Julius Cæsar crossing the Rubicon River with his armies, which you were not supposed to do. Hitherto that point, you did not cross the Rubicon River with your armies because you were then essentially saying, I'm coming in to take over. I'm destroying the republic. And he did that. Perhaps he might have been defeated. It was a gamble. As we know, he was not. After Julius Cæsar was killed on the Ides of March, that would have been yesterday, although I'm not sure it would have been yesterday. The calendar's changed. I'm not sure that our 15th of March was their 15th of March. Anyway, point being that things got a little chaotic in Rome. Amongst the government, it was unclear as to who was running things. Mark Antony, Mark Antony as we know him, was now the de facto leader of of Caesar's section of his what's the word? Faction of the government. But he was not in a power of strength. There's a lot of misconception about what had happened. And in essence, he had to negotiate his return to stand there at Caesar's funeral pyre and give the speech that he gave that roused up all the crowd. But following that, Mark Antony was a buffoon, folks. I mean, I know we have this image of him, Rex Harrison and Cleopatra, the wonderful series Rome, HBO did a few years ago. I love that show. Yes, I know it's historical fiction. I get it. But that is a show that I can just watch from beginning to end and then start over again and go over again. I have all the DVDs. I watch it pretty much annually. I know he's portrayed as a man of great strength and a man of great wisdom, but he wasn't. He was a drunkard. He was a womanizer. He was incredibly good looking, and he was a brilliant soldier. But he had his limitations, one of which was he was a horrible administrator. I mean, he was terrible at it. He couldn't do it. And even as a soldier, he preferred to be in situations where he seemed to shine in situations where he was in trouble as opposed to where he controlled the situation from beginning to end. He just wasn't his forte, as they would say. After the funeral pyre and after he begins to take over the administration of Rome, he is just making a pig's breakfast of the thing. I mean, it is just bad. Things are going in the tank, and it is clear that he is carrying out Caesar's desire to establish a dictatorship, which we would think of more in line of dictatorship today. They didn't use the same phraseology. To them, a dictator was not necessarily a bad thing, but it was clear that they were headed in a direction that's more familiar to us when we think of a dictatorship, a government that was intended to destroy the republic. Cicero, Marcus Cicero, who is one of the great leaders of Rome. He was an orator. He was a senator. He was a brilliant constitutionalist. Of course, opposed Mark Antony on this grounds and gave a series of 14 speeches that were called the Phillipics, and there's a reason why they call that, but I don't want to go into that boring history. This was the second time he had done this in his career, where he criticized someone through speech. And the first time it was a Macedonian by the name of Philip. Anyway, the point is, he really ripped Mark Antony big time. It was as if in our day he posted 1,440 character tweets that just absolutely burned out Mark Antony. And Mark Antony's response was, "Nuh-uh." I mean, that's how burned these speeches were. And people were listening to these speeches going, yeah, what about that, Mark Antony? What about that, Antonius? They would probably have said in Latin. What the heck here? And Mark Antony's response was very weak, and it was very angry. It was along the lines of, hey, shut up. But, of course, that's not effective. Ultimately, over the course of the next few years, Mark Antony's henchmen would hunt down Cicero and kill him. And Cicero's head and his hands were then brought to Rome, hammered onto a wall, nailed onto a wall, where Mark Antony's current wife, we say current because if you know Mark Antony, you know he's a bounder. His current wife pulled Cicero's tongue out of his head and drove a nail through it, a needle through it as a symbolic gesture to say, see, we shut you up. You may have said a bunch of brilliant things, but ultimately we killed you. Neener, neener, neener. This was the kind of approach that Rome took to what we today would call political free speech, which is critical to a republic. To be able to have free speech is it's a fundamental necessity in a republic. You can't really have a republic or even a democracy, a direct democracy, without having freedom of political speech. You just can't. because at what point you can't really discuss an idea. You can't really share thoughts and processes. And I've said this before, and I will say it probably till my dying day. I realize that your average, and that's a very broad painted term, but your average conservative listener, whether it's a talk show or podcast, tends to lean in the direction of the Second Amendment as being the most important. But the reality is that without the First Amendment, there's nothing. I mean, you can't, particularly the First Amendment's protection of free speech. I think that as Americans, if you go through our case law, it's pretty clear that this is the point of contention. This is the point area. This is the argument that we will go to the greatest degree. We will argue the First Amendment's freedom of speech because it is so precious to us. Think of the things that freedom of speech covers. I mean, you define speech however you choose to, but it covers everything. Yeah, we say press, media, religion, grievances, redress, all of those things are pointed out in there. But the broader aspects of the freedom of speech are that we can say things that, well, we can call Mark Antony a bounder and a cad. And the only thing that our versions of Mark Antony can really do is go, nah, that's the theory at least. Now we turn to the realities of today and why we should learn these lessons of history. In Utah, a state with which I am very familiar, well, I was. I haven't been to Utah since 2006, I guess. But I grew up there. I spent several years there as a high school student. And for many years, I kind of called Utah my home because it's where I graduated from high school. As far as the Navy was concerned, Utah was my state of residence. It was my stated home because that's where I enlisted from. And while I've spent more time in other places, particularly Colorado, I always kind of considered Utah home until I came to California. I'm pretty much a full-blooded Californian now. I have assimilated and adapted, and I do love California. Be that as it may, I was very familiar with Utah. Now, Utah has some unique dynamics to it. I'm just going to, there's a lot I could say about that. Utah had a major effect on my personal opinions about religious freedoms and how those work into things. I will tell you point blank, Utah, my experience in Utah is why I oppose public prayer in school. I just do. And if you had gone through what I went through in 1979 to 1981, you'd understand why. I don't have a lot of time to get into that today, and I don't want to. But Utah has a unique dynamic to it, which everybody is familiar with, and that is a dominant religious culture in Utah. Now, please don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm not criticizing the religious culture. That's not what I'm saying. But you have to understand the dynamic of how that religious culture affects politics in Utah. And once you understand that, you begin to see things a little bit, differently, as it were. In Utah this past week, the state legislature, both houses, unanimously passed what is known as SB 118 in Utah. Now, why does this matter to you? Well, because you probably don't live in Utah, although it's possible that you do. And if you do, hey, go Tigers. SB 118 is a reactionary bill. Much as we've seen here in California and in other states as well, it is a reaction to a perceived social threat. It is SB 118 is pure progressivism disguised as conservatism. Utah is a very conservative state, and so it tends to act in very conservative ways. And so when they perceive a threat, they react to it. And in the process of what they're doing here, Utah is this SB 118, which is now sitting on the governor's desk waiting to be signed. Essentially, what it does is outlaws online speech with the quote, intent to abuse or harass. Now, if you're following anything, I mean, California has something similar to this, although much more limited in scope. The idea here is that people online are being harassed. Okay, we all know that this happens. Hell, maybe you've been a victim of it. I have. Maybe you have as well. But the idea here is that the legislature of the state of Utah wants to put a stop to that. It wants to make that a criminal offense rather than a civil tort. They want to make it a criminal offense. They want to criminalize the behavior of what it defines as abuse or harassment or the intention to do this. Now, the problem becomes, well, what does that include? Well, kind of like Cicero in some ways. There's a very fine line between how something is said and how it is perceived as intentions go. And when it comes to free speech, there's it's not a fine line, but it's a very definitive line. And that has always been what the speech is aimed at. In other words, is the speech to a person or is it about a person? And if you sit and think for just a moment, you'll realize that those are two different things, very different things. If I'm speaking to someone and they don't want to hear me, can I force them to listen to me? Do I have a First Amendment right to make them listen? If I'm speaking about someone, they may not like what I'm saying, but it is likely, if not probable, that some of the people to whom I am speaking want to hear what I'm having to say. And if they don't, they can change the channel. Do you kind of see the difference here? Utah's bill, however, deals with this online harassment and goes specifically to its intent. Does the speech online intend to do these things? Does it intend to abuse or harass? So if someone gets on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or whatever and posts something that is intended to abuse me or harass me, under this law in the state of Utah, I would have actionable events. I could have them charged, as it were. And this sounds wonderful, doesn't it? I mean, how many commercials have we seen about cyberbullying and the likes of that? I mean, nobody is in favor of that, right? Nobody would support that sort of thing. But then again, we're back to, where is the speech aimed? Is it to a person? In other words, am I, not me because I wouldn't do this, but are you posting things that are to someone, your ex-girlfriend, your ex-spouse, your ex-lawyer, whatever, or are they about that person? And just warning, I mean, I had a family member the other day who posted a rather scathing review of a business where that relative lives. Is that harassment? Is it abuse? I mean, it was a pretty harsh post. You could argue that it was abuse, but was it? Because it was about that business rather than to that business. If you called that business up or sent them an email and said those same things, the likelihood is they'd hang up on you or delete your email. But since it's about them, where does it go? And all of this comes into play because we want to protect people, and we have this perceived social problem that cyberbullying is this huge thing. There's a story on Facebook today about a girl who committed suicide on Facebook Live because she was being bullied. It's not clear to me if it was cyberbullying or not, but let's, for the sake of argument, say that it was. And so her way of getting back was to hang herself on Facebook Live. It's a flawed, ideology here, but this causes reactions. It causes legislators and administrators and people of deep personal concern to say, well, there ought to be some way to stop this from happening. And so rather than dealing with the real problem, we deal with the perceived problem. The perceived social problem is cyberbullying. Somebody must have bullied her and caused her to do this. So we should stop cyberbullying because that will prevent this. Now, again, it's a flawed syllogism because the underlying axiom is bad, but this is the thought process that went into this SB 118. People are bullying people online. We don't like that. It has bad results. So we as legislators have a duty, I'm doing the air quote thing here, to put a stop to it. Perceived social problem, government solution, instant progressivism disguised as conservatism in the most conservative state in the union. You see how this works? Now, here's the big problem with SB 118, and hopefully you've already seen it. Hopefully you've already figured out what the problem is. Yesterday, in our country, a judge in Hawaii ruled that the new executive order banning travel from certain places is unconstitutional. He put a restraining order on it and blah, blah, blah. I could spend a lot of time talking about why. In essence, it comes back to intent. Does the president intend to set up a Muslim ban or not? For whatever reason, this judge believes that he does. That's what the state of Hawaii argued. Be that as it may, that's another show entirely. The almost immediate response that I saw to this was people posting on their Facebook pages the phone number, picture, name, work address, even as far as I could tell his court clerk's phone number and email address of the judge in Hawaii, with the comment of, hey, let's flood this guy with calls. Let's flood this guy with emails. Let's flood this guy with our dissatisfaction. Now listen, if you will, again, to the Utah law. Anybody who electronically publishes, posts, or otherwise discloses personal identifying information of another person in a public online site or forum without that person's permission is guilty of these crimes. Personal identification, by the way, is identified as follows: name, birth date, address, any one of these, not all of them together. Any one of these qualifies. Birth date, address, telephone number, driver's license number, social security number, place of employment, employee identification numbers, other personal identification numbers, mother's maiden name, electronic identification numbers, i.e. possibly email addresses, electronic signatures, any other numbers or information that can be used to access a person's financial resources or medical information, or a photograph or other related realistic images. Likeness is the word they use. Under the state of Utah's law, if you were in Utah, presumably, and the governor signs this, and you criticize this judge, and it's not clear to me if by the law, I mean, I would assume that you have to be in Utah to do this, but you criticize this judge in Hawaii, you could very well be breaking the law in Utah. Now, again, we go back to the problem here, which is that this progressive idealism here, which is to solve this online harassment thing, is great. But the problem is, who are the most likely candidates in the state of Utah to be criticized online? The most likely, most publicly criticized people in Utah to be criticized online would be whom? Is it, Ted Smith's boyfriend or girlfriend up in Provo or down in Provo? Or is it legislator A, B, or C in Salt Lake City? Do you start to see why we have to question the intention of this bill? Is the bill intended to protect, Mrs. Elliott in, West Valley? Or is it intended to protect assembly person or senator so-and-so or governor so-and-so or judge so-and-so in Salt Lake City from the idea of being politically harassed or abused online by a post made by somebody who disagrees with a political position that they have taken? Now, this isn't ancient Rome, obviously. They're not going to send henchmen out to take off people's heads and hands and nail them to the side of the state capitol building in Salt Lake City. But in essence, in a republic, we are making it a crime now to criticize a government official, a legislator, a judge in the state of Utah. Now, to their credit, they're not the first state to try this. Other states, particularly Tennessee, have tried this in the past, and the bill never made it through. The bill got into, it passed, and the public went freaking bananas, as they should have, criticizing the bill and criticizing the legislators that passed the bill. And lo and behold, the bill was backed away, and they went, yeah, you're right. We really can't do that. It's a violation of the First Amendment. It is a suppression of free speech. It is anti-American. It is antithetical to our belief system that in a republic, no one is above criticism. But so far, the state of Utah, this bill sitting on the governor's desk, is deaf, I think, to the idea that this is all well and good, and it might protect Mandy out in, Roy, Utah, from an abusive ex-boyfriend or something. But the more broad aspect of it, the unintentional, I disagree. I don't think it's unintentional, but the unintentional result of it is that, Congressman Flapjack from the 1st District in Utah, or Assembly Person, Waffle in the state legislature, is now suddenly immune to online criticism. And if you do criticize them, they're going to send the police out to freaking shut you down. And how far do you think that's going to go in the courts? And how much money is the state of Utah going to waste running this up through the circuit court system? And eventually, presumably, I can't imagine that anybody in the state of Utah would be stupid enough to appeal that to the Supreme Court. But on the assumption that they did, how long do you think the Supreme Court would actually take to issue an 8-0 or 9-0 ruling saying you can't limit free speech that isn't, in violation of the limits we've already put on it? And yet, they're going to try. The state of Utah may very well try this, and it's something that we, the people across the nation, need to be aware of. We need to be alert to. Sometimes I refer to this as having the right to be an asshole. It's part of who we are. It's what we are. It's unfortunate. It's a violation of the golden rule, and it's a violation of the good chap rule. But the fact of the matter is unless you have a few Ciceros around who are willing to stand up to government malfeasance, incompetence, those sorts of things, you're gonna run into problems. One of my good friends, Pepper, him, ionmodesto.com, Emerson Drake is famous. This is what he does. He is Modesto's Cicero. He will take on any issue all the time. Can you imagine if there was a rule in Modesto that says, we're going to put you in jail for that? But that's the kind of direction we're headed here if we're not careful in these laws restricting freedom of speech. You would think that after so many, 2 centuries plus, we would have this figured out. But even today, there are people who want to take the Mark Antony response to freedom of speech, criticizing government, cloak it in this idea that, we're protecting the people. And hopefully the people won't notice that who we're really protecting is ourselves against criticism. Well, Utah, we've noticed. Tennessee noticed. We haven't quite noticed yet here in California, but we will eventually. The question now to Utah is, are you really going to go down and do this damn silly thing this damn silly way? Or are you going to pull your heads out and go, hey, we're supposed to be conservatives. We're supposed to be protecting the Constitution, not violating it. And no, I'm going to veto this bill. And every time it comes back on my desk, unanimously passed by the legislature, I'm going to veto this bill because it's a violation of the First Amendment, and we don't do that here. And until we get to that point, we're going to need a few more Ciceros out in Utah and around the nation.
You are certainly not without accomplishments. It is a rare man who can boast of becoming a bankrupt before even coming of age. You have brought upon us war, pestilence, and destruction. You are Rome's Helen of Troy.
Constitution Thursday is a feature segment on Plausibly Live, the official podcast of The Dave Bowman Show. a Slippery Fish Entertainment production for the Podcast 99 Network. Copyright MMXV. All rights reserved. For more information, log on to constitutionthursday.com.